December 1792. Amid the heavy fog of the Potomac swamp, the first stone of the White House was laid. 200 years ago, this was just marshland between fields and a river. Today, every child on the planet knows this address. The White House. The entire story of America's most famous mansion. Sounds grand, doesn't it? But behind this beautiful facade lies a dark story few dare to tell. This house was not built by presidents. It was built by stonemasons, enslaved laborers, and immigrants whose names almost no one remembers. It survived the torch when British soldiers burned it to the brick. It watched Lincoln pace through sleepless nights during the Civil War. It heard the secret calls of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the world stood one step away from nuclear war. Here, kings and dictators were received. Here, it was decided who would fight and who would return home. In official photos, you see smiles and red carpets, but beneath them are compromises, fears, and decisions that changed the lives of millions. So what is the White House really? Just a beautiful mansion for presidents? Or a silent witness to America's darkest secrets? If you enjoy deep investigations into Gilded Age architecture and the families who built them, please like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments which house to explore next. Your support makes these detailed stories possible. Before we can understand the White House itself, we first have to understand why anyone would choose to build America's capital in such an unlikely place. The reason, as in so many chapters of American history, comes down to compromise, political horse trading, and the messy reality of stitching together 13 quarreling states into a single nation. In the summer of 1790, the fate of America's future capital was effectively sealed, not by a grand master plan, but by a private dinner deal that later became legendary in American politics. Alexander Hamilton, the ambitious Secretary of the Treasury, desperately needed support for his controversial financial program, a plan for the federal government to assume the Revolutionary War debts of the individual states. This proposal had become hopelessly deadlocked in Congress, with Southern representatives deeply suspicious of what they saw as a Northern power grab. These debts were no small sum. They amounted to roughly $25 million, or well over $800 million in today's money. For a young nation, this was a crushing burden. Thomas Jefferson, recently returned from France to serve as Secretary of State, found himself in the role of unlikely broker. At a private dinner in his residence on Maiden Lane in New York City, Jefferson brought together Hamilton and James Madison, the influential congressman from Virginia. What unfolded over that meal became a founding bargain of American geography. Hamilton would secure enough Southern votes for his assumption plan. In exchange, the permanent capital of the United States would be placed on the Potomac River, on territory carved from Maryland and Virginia, rooting the seat of government firmly in the South. This was no small concession. At the time, several established cities were competing fiercely for the honor. Philadelphia, New York, Baltimore. All were functioning urban centers with infrastructure, established merchant elites, and the basic amenities of civilized life. The Potomac site, by contrast, was a stretch of tidal marshland, forest, and clay soil that flooded with disturbing regularity. In modern terms, the location was wildly impractical. It would be like deciding today to build a new capital not in a metropolitan area, but in a humid, mosquito-ridden bottomland, hours away from anywhere of consequence. Yet, this very remoteness appealed to some. Southern planters, including George Washington himself, owned significant property in the region and stood to profit handsomely from the land speculation that would follow. At the same time, a capital built from nothing could be imagined as a pure symbol of Republican virtue, untouched by the commercial corruption of older cities. In the minds of its advocates, it could become an American Rome, a planned city of broad avenues and classical monuments rising out of the wilderness to embody the democratic ideals of the new republic. So, on July 16, 1790, President Washington signed the Residence Act into law, designating a federal district of 10 miles square along the Potomac River as the permanent seat of government, The temporary capital would remain in Philadelphia for roughly a decade while the new city took shape. Washington himself received extraordinary authority to choose the exact location and to oversee the planning and construction of the federal buildings. What followed was something halfway between urban planning and wilderness taming, between soaring architectural ambition and the brutal reality of mud, disease, and distance. The United States was about to try to build a capital city almost from scratch, in a place that nature had never intended for such grand purposes, and the White House would stand at the center of that risky experiment. The question facing President Washington was no longer just where to place a few buildings, but how to create a capital that looked and felt worthy of a nation which saw itself as heir to classical Republican virtue. To turn this nameless marsh into an empire, Washington needed more than a dinner deal. He needed a grandiose vision. Enter Pierre Charles L'Enfant, a French-born military engineer who had served with distinction during the Revolutionary War. L'Enfant arrived at the Potomac site in March 1791. In that waterlogged, uneven landscape, he saw not limitation but possibility. Where others noticed mud, standing water, and clouds of mosquitoes, L'Enfant imagined sweeping boulevards and dramatic vistas. The plan he presented to Washington that summer was audacious. He designed a city, not for the fragile young republic of the moment, but for the powerful empire he believed it would one day become. At the core of L'Enfant's vision was a grid of streets overlaid with bold, diagonal avenues. They radiated from key points, creating grand perspectives like those in Versailles or Baroque Rome. He picked out two prominent hills in the landscape, Jenkins Hill, and a rise roughly 1.5 miles to the northwest. He marked them as the two great poles of Republican government. On Jenkins Hill would stand the Congress House, what we now call the Capitol. The northwestern elevation would host the President's House. L'Enfant insisted these two structures command clear views of one another across a broad public mall, a visual line symbolizing the connection between the legislative and executive branches. In L'Enfant's mind, the President's House was meant to be truly palatial. He envisioned a residence about 5 times larger than the structure that was ultimately built. It was to be a sprawling complex suited for state ceremonies, public receptions, and the everyday business of a growing nation. Set high on its hill, it would function as a Republican palace. It would be visible from the Potomac River and the avenues converging upon it. Broad vistas would stretch in several directions, allowing the chief magistrate, symbolically at least, to survey the city and the country entrusted to his care. But within that grand vision lay the seeds of L'Enfant's undoing. He refused to compromise. He clashed constantly with the commissioners appointed to oversee the city's development. He even insisted on tearing down any existing structures that interfered with his avenues. Those disputes escalated until he ordered the demolition of a manor house belonging to Daniel Carroll, a nephew of one of the most powerful commissioners, without proper authorization. That act pushed tensions past the breaking point. In February 1792, less than a year after presenting his design, L'Enfant was dismissed from the project. Yet, the heart of his vision survived. The commissioners kept the essential layout of diagonal avenues and the siting of the major federal buildings. But they trimmed back his more extravagant ideas. The President's House, in particular, had to be reimagined as something more restrained, impressive enough to project dignity, but not so lavish as to suggest a royal palace. That core tension between Republican simplicity and national grandeur would shape every major decision about the building's design. At that point, the commissioners made a choice that would have lasting consequences for the mansion's character. They decided to hold a public competition for the design of the President's House. In March 1792, an advertisement ran in newspapers across the states. It invited architects and builders to submit plans for a residence capable of housing the President, his family, and a, quote, suitable number of attendants. The prize was set at $500, or a medal of equal value. This was a substantial reward for the time, equivalent to about $16,000 in today's currency. even if it didn't truly match the prestige of designing the executive mansion for a new republic. The competition drew a strange mix of entries. They ranged from strictly practical plans to almost fantastic visions submitted by men whose names have mostly vanished from the records. Alongside them was one notable anonymous design, later attributed to Thomas Jefferson himself. From that pile of drawings and dreams, a winning plan emerged, one that would fix the architectural image of the American presidency for centuries, though perhaps not in the way any of the competitors, or even the commissioners, fully imagined at the time. The designs that arrived throughout the spring and summer of 1792 revealed something fascinating about how Americans thought their president should live. Every plan was more than just an architectural sketch. It was a political statement about the kind of executive power a young republic, fresh from a war against kings, was willing to accept. The commissioner's brief was deliberately vague, likely by design. The president's house should be spacious, large enough for official receptions and state business, but the exact dimensions were left to each designer. It had to project dignity without drifting into ostentation, grandeur without looking royal. That ambiguity opened the door to vastly different visions of what an executive mansion in a republic should be. Some entries leaned heavily on the European palace tradition. They featured long, multi-winged facades, rich ornamentation, and ceremonial halls that would not look out of place in a royal residence. Unsurprisingly, these plans found little favor with the commissioners. They were painfully aware of accusations that the new federal government already looked too much like a monarchy in disguise. Other submissions swung to the opposite extreme. They offered buildings so modest and plain they could easily have been the townhouses of a prosperous merchant. Practical, yes, but hardly a setting for receiving foreign ambassadors or hosting state dinners. One particularly intriguing design came from an anonymous contestant, signed only with the initials A. The plan proposed a sprawling, villa-like structure, clearly inspired by the Italian Renaissance villas of Andrea Palladio, featuring a central rotunda and symmetrical wings stretching to either side. It was sophisticated, carefully proportioned, and clearly drawn by someone with true architectural training. Later research would reveal that this anonymous entry came from none other than Thomas Jefferson himself. It seems he couldn't resist submitting his own ideas of what the president's house should be. Despite serving as Secretary of State, Jefferson's design, while refined, had a serious flaw in the eyes of the commissioners. It felt too grand and too European. It was too close to the aristocratic homes he had admired in France. Above all, they almost certainly guessed who had drawn it. Jefferson's love for Palladian forms was no secret. Accepting his design would look like favoring a powerful cabinet member. Rejecting it publicly would create a political embarrassment. The simplest solution was the silent one. Set it aside and move on. Many other entries exposed the limits of architectural expertise in America at the time. The young republic had very few architects in the European sense. Most builders had learned their trade through apprenticeships and hands-on work, not through formal study of classical rules and proportions. As a result, many submissions were clearly local in character, structurally sound and practical, but lacking the sophistication and balance that could give the building a true presence on the world stage. What the commissioners were actually looking for, even if they struggled to articulate it, was a design that could thread an almost impossibly narrow needle. The president's house had to be imposing enough to command respect from foreign powers accustomed to kings and palaces, yet restrained enough to reassure American citizens that their president remained a fellow citizen, not a monarch in waiting. It needed to echo classical Republican models, more Rome than Versailles, while still functioning as a practical home for both official business and private family life. In short, the building had to embody the entire paradox of American executive power. Strong but limited, dignified but democratic, permanent but never dynastic. As summer faded into the autumn of 1792, the commissioners sifted through the submissions with growing frustration. No single design quite matched the vision in their heads. Some captured parts of it, but failed in other critical ways. The deadline passed, and there was still no clear winner. It began to look as if the competition might end in disappointment, forcing the commissioners to extend the call for entries, or quietly abandon the idea and hire someone directly. At exactly this moment of uncertainty, a new design arrived from an unexpected direction. Not from a famous architect in Philadelphia or New York, but from an Irish immigrant builder living and working in Charleston, South Carolina. His name was James Hoban, and his calm, balanced proposal would go on to define what the home of the American president looked like for more than 2 centuries. The man whose design would ultimately define the most famous address in America began his life as far from presidential grandeur as possible. James Hoban was born around 1755 in County Kilkenny, Ireland, in the rural district of Callan. It was a landscape of tenant farmers, small cottages, and narrow roads, a world for a talented young man with no family name to lean on. Ireland in the mid-18th century offered little real opportunity for upward mobility, especially for Catholics living under the harsh penal laws. These laws restricted their right to own property, practice many professions, or participate fully in public life. But Hoban possessed both ambition and skill. As a teenager, he apprenticed with a builder, learning the hands-on trade of masonry and carpentry alongside the more refined craft of architectural drawing. His abilities soon caught the attention of patrons, who helped him enter the Dublin Society's drawing school. There, promising students studied architectural drawing, perspective, and the classical orders that formed the backbone of Georgian design. During these formative years in Dublin, Hoban encountered a building that would leave a profound mark on his imagination: Leinster House, the grand townhouse of the Duke of Leinster. Completed in 1748 and designed by Richard Castles, Leinster House showed Georgian architecture at its most controlled and elegant. It was a solid stone structure with precise symmetry, calm proportions, and restrained classical detailing. It projected aristocratic power, but also a kind of cool republican gravity. It avoided the heavy ornamentation of Baroque palaces, while still commanding attention. For Hoban, Leinster House seemed like the perfect model, architecture that spoke of permanence and dignity without tipping into royal ostentation. After the American Revolution, a wave of immigrants left Ireland for the new United States. Skilled artisans found themselves in high demand. Hoban crossed the Atlantic in the mid-1780s, first settling in Philadelphia before moving south to Charleston, South Carolina, where a thriving port economy was fueling a building boom. By 1792, Hoban had built a solid reputation in Charleston as both a builder and architect. He had several significant projects to his name, including the State House, a structure later destroyed by fire. When news of the competition for the presidential mansion reached Charleston, Hoban recognized an opportunity that might never come again. He prepared his submission by drawing heavily on his memory of Leinster House, reshaping its Georgian balance for the American Republican context. His proposal called for a 3-story structure, counting the raised basement, built of stone, with a central entrance hall and regularly spaced windows across the facade. The plan was essentially a refined rectangle: grand staterooms on the main floor, family quarters above, service spaces below. It was practical, formal, and clearly rooted in the Irish-Georgian tradition he had absorbed in Dublin. Most importantly, Hoban understood something many of his rivals had misjudged: scale. His building was large, but not overwhelming. It was imposing enough for diplomatic receptions, yet compact enough to function as a real home. While L'Enfant had imagined a residence 5 times larger, and Jefferson a complex villa, Hoban offered a structure that could be reasonably built within a realistic budget and time frame, while still giving the office of the presidency tangible weight. Hoban's design also offered a subtle advantage: architectural diplomacy. It avoided dramatic stylistic gestures that could be read as political statements. The Georgian language was familiar in America from colonial public buildings. It felt established rather than experimental, classical rather than trendy, stable rather than showy. In a moment of intense political division, that kind of architectural neutrality was exactly what the commissioners wanted, even if they never put it into words. When the commissioners met in July 1792 to evaluate the final entries, Hoban's plan stood out. It combined competence, clarity, and the right degree of ambition. President Washington, who participated in the final selection, reportedly appreciated both the practicality and the dignity of the design. On July 16, 1792, exactly 2 years after the Residence Act was signed, James Hoban was declared the winner. He received the promised prize of $500 and, far more importantly, the task of overseeing the construction of the presidential mansion. The obscure Irish immigrant had secured the chance to shape America's most iconic residence. But the harder parts lay ahead. Turning drawings on paper into stone walls rising from a muddy hillside on the banks of the Potomac. The distance between a beautiful architectural drawing and a real building rising from marshy ground is not measured in inches. It is measured in thousands of hours of back-breaking labor, endless supply problems, and the kind of stubborn persistence that rarely makes it into the history books. After securing the commission, James Hoban now had to turn his tightly composed plans into stone and mortar on a site that seemed designed by nature to resist him at every turn. The ceremonial laying of the cornerstone took place on October 13, 1792, in a Masonic ritual led by the Georgetown Lodge. Formal speeches, measured steps, and symbolic tools gave the moment an air of harmony and control. In reality, they were blessing the start of a brutal project in a location that was barely ready to hold a stable, let alone a presidential mansion. The site chosen for the mansion sat on a modest rise, not the dramatic hilltop L'Enfant had once imagined, but high enough to provide some drainage and a clear view. That slight elevation would prove critical, as the surrounding ground remained stubbornly wet and unstable. Before a single foundation stone could be laid, the land had to be tamed. The area was densely forested, and crews spent weeks felling trees, hauling out stumps, and hacking through undergrowth. Then came the grading and leveling of the ground. It was an exhausting process, made worse by heavy clay soil that turned into a sticky, impassable slurry whenever it rained. Workers dug drainage ditches to pull water away from the future basement, but these channels needed constant clearing and repair as the Potomac's seasonal flooding tested every temporary fix. For much of that first year, more shovels were at work than chisels. The site had to be forced into something that looked roughly like a place where a foundation could sit securely. The workforce assembled on this muddy hill reflected the unequal, mixed world of early American labor. Hoban brought several skilled artisans from Charleston, many of them Irish and Scottish stonemasons who knew how to handle the local Aquia Creek sandstone chosen for the exterior. Their expertise earned relatively high wages for the time, often $1 or more a day. In the 1790s, that was a significant price. Working alongside them were local laborers, men drawn by the promise of steady pay and the rare chance to say they were helping build something the entire country was watching. However, from the very beginning, the project also relied heavily on enslaved labor. The commissioners, constantly short on cash and struggling to attract enough workers to this remote, unhealthy site, turned to the solution used by the Maryland and Virginia elite whenever they needed many hands. They hired enslaved men from nearby plantations. These workers were hired by the year or the season. The payments did not go to the men doing the digging and lifting. They went to the men who claimed to own them. Almost all of this heavy, backbreaking work fell to enslaved black men. The system kept costs low and the work moving, but it also stamped a brutal truth into the very foundations of the executive mansion. The men who would never be allowed to vote, never be counted as a whole, never legally own land, and never enjoy the rights the new republic claimed to cherish, were building the very house where the laws and policies of their enslavement would be signed. The commissioners' ledgers carefully recorded the money paid to slaveholders, but often reduced the actual workers to a cold, repetitive phrase, Negro hire. Even on paper, the people whose bodies made the house possible became faceless. As late 1792 bled into winter, foundation work continued. Crews excavated the basement that would one day hold kitchens, storage rooms, and service corridors. The foundation walls were laid with local stone, set in lime mortar, and built up layer by layer. Progress was necessarily slow. Each section had to sit and harden before more weight could be safely placed on top. Winter brought its own set of problems. Freezing temperatures could crack fresh mortar, daylight hours were short, and the simple difficulty of keeping men working outside, when cold, wind, and mud, turned every day into a test of endurance. By the spring of 1793, after more than 6 months of clearing, digging, draining, and laying hidden stone, the site finally reached a critical turning point. The outline of the basement was in place, the foundation was secured, and the hill above the Potomac was ready for something the eye could finally see. The stage was set for the most demanding and visible phase of the project, raising the heavy stone walls that would give the presidential mansion its shape and silhouette on the American horizon for centuries to come. With the foundation finally secured, and the spring of 1793 bringing warmer weather, attention turned to the part everyone would actually see, raising the presidential mansion out of the ground. This is where we must pause the story of stone and mortar, to look at the actual hands that built them. Because if you want to understand the true cost of the presidential mansion, not in dollars, not in political horse trading, you have to look closely at those hands. You have to look at the very different lives of the men whose labor made these walls rise. The workforce that raised the presidential mansion out of the Potomac mud reflected all the contradictions of the early American Republic. On any given day in the 1790s, you would have seen a clear labor hierarchy. High-paid master artisans, journeymen trying to climb the ladder, and enslaved men whose wages went straight into someone else's pocket, all working together to build a house meant to represent democratic government. At the top stood the European-trained master artisans, particularly the stonemasons and carpenters whose knowledge was simply irreplaceable. Many came from Ireland, Scotland, and England, drawn by the promise of higher wages and more opportunity than they could ever hope for at home. James Hoban maintained close ties with the Irish building community and recruited heavily from Charleston and other port cities. These masters earned significant wages, often between $1 and $2 a day, equivalent to roughly $32 to $64 in today's currency, plus room and board. Their names appear repeatedly in the commissioners' accounting ledgers. Colin Williamson, the Scottish mason who oversaw much of the exterior, Philip Hart and John Sheehan, the Irish carpenters responsible for shaping the building's interior woodwork. Beneath them worked the journeymen and apprentices, men still learning the trade, or not yet established enough to command top rates. They might earn between 50 and 75 cents a day. Still, it was a solid income that could support a family and, over time, fund their own rise to master status. The commissioners did their best to attract these workers, running advertisements in newspapers across the mid-Atlantic and promising steady employment on a project of national importance. Even so, keeping the site fully staffed was a constant struggle. The remoteness of the capital, the stifling climate, and the availability of other work in older, more comfortable cities meant the presidential mansion was always competing for hands. That persistent shortage pushed the commissioners toward a solution that Virginia and Maryland planters knew well: enslaved labor. Increasingly, they turned to hiring enslaved men from nearby plantations. Enslaveholders contracted their workers out to the project for a month, a season, or a year. The commissioners paid the owners. The men doing the work received nothing but basic food and shelter. The records show this system in cold, clinical language. Payments to Charles Diggins for 5 Negro men for 1 year. Money to Notley Young for hire of slaves. The ledgers listed the plantation owners while the laborers themselves remained nameless. But if you dig deeper, if you turn the pages of those old ledgers carefully enough, sometimes you find something more than just a cold line item. In the records of Daniel Carroll, one of the largest landowners contributing both land and labor to the project, names emerge: Tom, Peter, Ben, Dan. Only first names, never last names, because in this system, they were not allowed to have their own. But these are names. These were specific men. Tom is listed as a carpenter. Peter worked on the stone. Their skills were valuable enough to be noted in the record, even if their freedom was not. These enslaved men bore the brunt of the heaviest, dirtiest, and most dangerous work on the site. They quarried and hauled stone, mixed mortar, lugged materials up scaffolding, dug drainage ditches, and cleared trees and stumps. Some brought true skill to the task. Documents mention enslaved carpenters, bricklayers, and even stonemasons. Yet, even when their expertise matched that of free workers, they were often valued at a lower wage rate, with every cent still flowing into the pockets of their enslavers. A man hauling stone blocks through a Washington summer, dressed in thin clothes and poor footwear, living on rations calculated for low cost rather than health, faced conditions that would test even modern construction crews with better tools and safety gear. Working side by side did not erase the social lines between free and enslaved workers. It made them sharper. Some free laborers resented the presence of enslaved men on the site, arguing that enslaved competition drove down their own wages and made it harder to negotiate better terms. Meanwhile, the enslavers treated their workers as property, even in this public context, complaining loudly when men were injured or sick, and demanding compensation for damaged labor. The commissioners had to manage all of this, mediating disputes, meeting the owners, complaints, and trying to keep enough workers on the job when men got sick, ran away, or simply refused to continue in such harsh conditions. Despite the government's reputation for detailed paperwork, enslaved workers were often nearly erased from the official record. Free workers appeared with full names and occupations. Pay John Davis for masonry work. Enslaved men appeared as categories: Negro hire, slave labor, or, at best, a single first name attached to the enslaver's account. Years of backbreaking work on the presidential mansion can be summed up in a single, bland line item. Their bodies helped turn Hoban's drawings into stone walls. Yet, the bureaucracy reduced them to anonymous cost units. It took generations before historians began the slow, careful work of pulling these figures out of the shadows, tracing scattered references, cross-checking ledgers and correspondence, and recovering at least some of the names and stories of the men who built America's most famous home, while being denied the very basic freedoms that home was supposed to represent. Tom, Peter, Ben, Dan. These names are not the whole story. They are only fragments, salvaged from a record that never intended to remember them. But they are something. They are proof that these men existed, that they had skill, and that they built something permanent while they themselves were held in chains. By the autumn of 1800, the presidential mansion remained frustratingly unfinished, yet events left no other choice. It had to receive its first resident. The primary building material, Aquia Creek sandstone, came from quarries in Stafford County, Virginia, about 40 miles south of the future capital. The choice was practical. The stone was relatively soft, meaning masons could cut and shape it more easily than harder granite, and it existed in sufficient quantities for a project of this scale. Most importantly, it could be moved by water. The quarries were located near navigable inlets. This allowed massive blocks to be loaded onto barges and floated up the Potomac toward the construction site. Without this river route, the rugged dirt roads of the era would never have survived the weight and volume of stone required for such an ambitious building. The journey of each block, from raw rock face to finished wall, passed through many hands in a series of dangerous stages. At the quarries, The crews were once again a mix of free laborers and enslaved men hired from nearby plantations. They used hammers, wedges, and iron bars to split the stone along its natural grain, breaking off rough blocks that could weigh several 100 pounds or more. These pieces were then maneuvered onto barges using wooden cranes, levers, and a lot of shouting. Every lift carried the risk of a snapped rope or a shifting block crushing anyone standing too close. The barge trip upriver could take several days, depending on wind, current, and tide. By the time the stones reached the wharf in Georgetown, many had chipped edges or hairline fractures. Before a stone could become part of the presidential wall, it needed more work, trimming, squaring, and sometimes cutting away damaged sections entirely. All of that meant more labor, more time, and the constant risk of waste if a weakened block finally failed on the scaffolding. Once a stone reached the construction site, its true transformation began. Skilled masons, many of them Irish and Scottish craftsmen trained in the Georgian tradition, took over with hammers, chisels, and years of experience behind every swing. They transformed those rough chunks into ashlar, the clean rectangular stones that give the presidential mansion its calm, orderly appearance. A single block could take hours of steady work, chipping away excess, sharpening corners, checking with a straight edge, and refining the visible surface until it matched the lines measured in Hoban's drawings. There was little room for error. A stone cut too short or too thin couldn't be patched. It had to be discarded, taking all the invested labor with it. At the same time, other crews handled the invisible component that would bind the entire structure together: lime mortar. Producing it was a demanding process in its own right. Workers burned limestone in kilns at high temperatures for days, then carefully slaked the quicklime with water, turning it into a usable paste. The mixture had to be exact. Too much lime, and the mortar would shrink and crack as it dried. Too little, and it would never achieve the strength needed to hold heavy stone walls. Skilled masons blended the slaked lime with sand and water just before use, knowing the mixture would begin to set within hours and couldn't be stored for another day. Building the walls was slow, deliberate work. The rows of finished ashlar were laid layer by layer. Each horizontal course needed to sit perfectly level before another could be added on top. Masons relied on plumb lines and spirit levels to keep both vertical and horizontal lines precise, fully aware that even small errors at lower levels would multiply as the structure rose, threatening the building's stability. Wooden scaffolding crawled up alongside the walls, lashed together with ropes and constantly adjusted. Workers hauled stones up ramps or lifted them with pulleys, guiding each piece into place with shouted instructions and calloused hands. The work didn't stop for the weather, but bent under it. Summer on the Potomac brought thick heat, insects, and a glare that bounced off the pale stone. Winter brought freezing winds that stung numb fingers and threatened to damage fresh mortar if temperatures dropped too quickly. Yet progress depended on more than just the weather. Funding delays slowed the purchase of materials. Shortages of skilled labor forced a constant shuffling of tasks. By modern standards, the pace was agonizingly slow. Weeks of effort might only raise the wall by a few feet. Step by step, however, the structure emerged. Gradually, the building's Georgian proportions began to appear against the sky. The southern facade took shape first, with regular openings left for windows and a central section reserved for the future portico. What had once been a rugged hill above a swampy riverbank now held tangible proof that the grand promises made on parchment in Philadelphia were being translated into stone. Every inch of that progress, every block laid and joint filled, depended entirely on the men doing the lifting, cutting, and mixing. The stone had value, but the hands that raised it were treated as if they had none. What was once a rugged hill above a swampy river now held tangible proof that grand promises were being turned into stone. And on that hill, the men continued to labor in the shadow of a building that was never intended to remember them. By the autumn of 1800, The presidential mansion remained frustratingly unfinished. Yet, events left no other choice. It had to receive its first resident. The 10-year agreement allowing Philadelphia to serve as the temporary capital had expired. The federal government was obligated to move to the new city on the Potomac, ready or not. President John Adams, nearing the end of his bitterly contested single term, found himself in the strange position of moving into a residence that, in many ways, was still a construction site. The house waiting for the Adams family only partially matched Hoban's vision. While the exterior walls were raised and the Aquia Creek sandstone gave the building a grand presence on its low hill, the interior was raw. Only 6 rooms were plastered and made even remotely habitable. The grand staircase was missing. The planned north entrance had no portico, so visitors climbed temporary wooden steps to gain entry. Outside, the grounds were a mess of timber piles, clay heaps, broken stone, and worker tents. It felt more like a shipyard than a setting for presidential receptions. Nevertheless, Adams left Philadelphia in early November, jolting along rugged southern roads while wagons carried his furniture and official papers. He arrived at the mansion on November 1, 1800, becoming the first chief executive to sleep beneath its roof. His wife, Abigail, stayed behind for a few weeks to manage family business in Massachusetts. On his first night in the building, Adams wrote to her with a mix of hope and unease, adding a line that would later be etched into national lore. "I pray heaven to bestow the best of blessings on this house, and all that shall hereafter inhabit it. May none but honest and wise men ever rule under this roof." When Abigail Adams finally arrived in mid-November, her reaction was far less romantic than her husband's blessing. In letters to friends and family, she described a daily grind of discomfort and improvisation. The house was perpetually cold. Only a handful of fireplaces were finished and functional. Firewood in the new capital was scarce and expensive, so keeping the rooms at a bearable temperature was a constant source of anxiety. Outside the mansion, there was almost nothing. Washington City was little more than scattered buildings in muddy clearings. With a capital as unfinished as the mansion itself, and few services within reach, Abigail's most memorable adjustment involved the East Room. This vast space was designed for grand receptions and state events. In reality, with its bare walls and rough floors, it was useless for anything formal, so she turned it into a massive laundry room. The size and ventilation of the room made it perfect for drying clothes. In an instant, the space intended to receive dignitaries was filled with damp linens and shirts hanging on temporary lines. It is an unforgettable image, the underwear and sheets of the first family swaying in the breeze, where the young republic had imagined elegant gatherings and glittering ceremonies. Inside this half-finished shell, the Adams staff struggled to maintain even basic routines. Servants carried water by hand from nearby springs because the house had no plumbing of any kind. Cooking happened in the basement kitchen over open fires, with hot dishes then carried up narrow stairs to the family's rooms. With so little finished space, formal entertaining took place in cramped, awkward settings that fell far short of what a head of state needed to receive foreign diplomats or host congressional leaders. In many respects, the Adams administration in the new capital existed within a kind of, quote, polite chaos. The machinery of government was squeezed into the reality of a construction site. Fortunately for the family, this uncomfortable chapter didn't last long. Adams lost the bitterly fought election of 1800 to Thomas Jefferson, his former ally turned sharp political rival. The defeat meant he would only inhabit the unfinished mansion for about 4 months, from November 1800 to March 1801. Stung by the loss, Adams reportedly left Washington before dawn on Inauguration Day, returning to Massachusetts and pointedly avoiding Jefferson's swearing in. The task of transforming the mansion from a barely habitable shell into something closer to its intended dignity would fall not to Adams, but to the man who had once slipped an anonymous design into the original competition, Thomas Jefferson. His refined architectural taste and deep personal contradictions would leave a lasting mark on the building itself and on the moral compromises woven into its completion. Thomas Jefferson took office in March 1801 with strong views on architecture, Republican symbolism, and how a president should live. But his years in the presidential mansion would also expose, more clearly than almost any other presidency, how far American ideals stood from American reality. Where John Adams simply endured an unfinished house, Thomas Jefferson saw an opportunity. He sought to reshape it, bending the building to his own vision. But his years in the presidential mansion would also expose, perhaps more clearly than any other presidency, just how far American ideals stood from American reality. Jefferson had held opinions on the presidential mansion long before he carried the keys. Years earlier, during the design competition, he had quietly submitted his own anonymous proposal, a modest, Palladian-style villa that reflected his personal taste. Now, as president, he found himself living not in that villa, but in James Hoban's solid Georgian mansion, which he privately considered somewhat bland. Yet, Jefferson was nothing if not practical. Instead of tearing down what existed, he focused on strategic changes, places where he could leave a visible mark without gutting the building. His most significant structural additions were the east and west terraces, low, colonnaded wings stretching from either side of the main block. On paper, they were simple. In practice, they solved several problems at once. The terraces masked stables, storage rooms, and workspaces behind elegant rows of columns. They provided the classical touches Jefferson believed a Republican building required, and they linked the main residence to its service buildings without scattering separate outbuildings across the grounds. The cost for these improvements was not small. Constructing the terraces, including the stone columns and roofing, cost about $20,000 at the time, equivalent to approximately $450,000 in today's currency. In Jefferson's mind, these wings were proof that beauty and utility did not need to be at war. Inside, he turned his attention to rooms that, under Adams, had been barely habitable. He oversaw the purchase and placement of furniture, often choosing French-style pieces he had admired during his time as minister to France. The East Room, the vast space Abigail Adams had used for laundry, remained unfinished throughout his presidency. Jefferson had little interest in massive ceremonial gatherings. He preferred smaller, controlled settings. Rather than rushing to complete a grand ballroom, he invested in the spaces where he actually lived and worked. A well-stocked library, writing rooms for his vast correspondence and scientific tools, and dining rooms suited for the intimate dinners that became his favorite way of conducting politics. Jefferson treated the land surrounding the house with the same care. A passionate gardener and farmer, he oversaw the planting of trees and the layout of gardens. He imagined the grounds of the presidential mansion as something between a working farm and a gentleman's estate, not a showcase of pure ornament, but a place where productivity itself signaled Republican virtue. Vegetable patches appeared. Experimental crops took root. Slowly, the muddy construction site began to look like a managed landscape. Yet beneath this cultivated surface lay a reality Jefferson could never fully reconcile. The work of finishing and refining the mansion still relied heavily on enslaved labor. Jefferson brought enslaved people from Monticello to serve in the mansion as chefs, servants, and laborers. They maintained his household in Washington, while the law still counted them as his property. The contradiction was staggering. The author of the phrase, "all men are created equal," was running a presidential household staffed in part by men and women who could be bought and sold. The construction work during Jefferson's 2 terms followed the same pattern established from the start. The terraces he added, the landscaping he ordered, the interior finishing he oversaw, all relied on a mixed workforce. Free artisans earned wages and could, in theory, walk away. The enslaved laborers could not. Some of these enslaved men were highly skilled, yet the wages for their work went to their owners. Their labor made Jefferson's refinements possible, even as the system they were trapped in mocked the very ideas the building was meant to represent. Jefferson was not blind to this. In his letters, he could condemn slavery as a moral wrong and a threat to the Republic. In his daily life, he continued to depend on it, expanding his own holdings even as he wrote of its dangers. That tension, clear in his words but harsher in his actions, took physical form in the presidential mansion. This was a structure meant to embody equality before the law, maintained by a hierarchy so unequal that some who worked there did not legally own their own bodies. The terraces, gardens, and carefully arranged interiors, Jefferson added, would outlast his time in office, shaping how future presidents experienced the building. But the moral compromises woven into the house during his tenure would also endure. They sat quietly in the stone, in the service corridors, in the memories of those who labored there without choice, waiting for future generations to acknowledge them openly, even if that honesty threatened the comforting myths of the founding era. And all this refinement, all of Jefferson's careful shaping of the mansion, was about to be tested in the harshest way imaginable. Not by a political rival or a tight budget, but by an invading army and an open flame. The War of 1812, the often overlooked clash between the United States and Britain, had dragged on for over 2 years without a clear winner. Then, in the summer of 1814, British strategy suddenly shifted. The War of 1812, an often overlooked clash between the United States and Great Britain, had dragged on for over 2 years without a clear winner. Then, in the summer of 1814, British strategy suddenly shifted. With Napoleon defeated in Europe and veteran troops now available, Britain decided on a direct strike at the American capital. It was a calculated blow meant to humiliate the young republic and force better peace terms. The presidential mansion, the ultimate symbol of American executive power, was about to become a very visible victim of imperial revenge. In August 1814, British forces under Major General Robert Ross and Rear Admiral George Cockburn landed in Maryland and began their march toward Washington. The American defense, hastily assembled and poorly coordinated, collapsed at the Battle of Bladensburg on August 24th. President James Madison, who had actually ridden out to see the fighting, making him the only sitting president to witness direct combat while in office, watched as the American militia units crumbled and fled before the disciplined British regulars. With the defenders dissolved, the road to Washington lay open. Madison hurried back to the mansion to find a capital in full retreat. Officials were fleeing with chests of papers. Citizens were scrambling to evacuate. Inside the mansion, his wife, Dolly, was directing one of the most famous rescue efforts in presidential history. Calm under pressure as the British Army drew closer, Dolly Madison oversaw the packing of vital state documents. Most famously, she insisted on saving Gilbert Stuart's full-length portrait of George Washington. The painting was bolted to the wall in the state dining room. Rather than wasting time with careful unscrewing, her servant smashed the frame and cut the canvas out. That single act of cultural triage, performed as an invading army approached, fixed Dolly Madison's place in American memory. Yet, it was only one moment in a day filled with disaster. As the Madisons crossed the Potomac and headed west, the British Army marched almost unopposed into Washington on the evening of August 24th. What followed at the presidential mansion has taken on the light of legend, but the core details are well documented. British officers led by Admiral Cockburn entered the mansion and found it empty, but with dinner still laid out in the state dining room. Whether the meal had been prepared for the Madisons' expected return, or simply abandoned in the rush to evacuate, remains uncertain. The British officers did what hungry soldiers do. They sat down and ate it. Sitting at the very table of the American president, they reportedly toasted the success of the British arms while eating his abandoned dinner. It was part reality, part theater, a sharp, small gesture, mocking the idea of American sovereignty even before the first torch was lit. Then, they set about destroying the building. The goal was not random looting, but the deliberate crippling of government infrastructure. British soldiers piled furniture into heaps. They added books, papers, curtains, and anything else that would burn, and set fires throughout the mansion. For 14 years, the house had been filled with wooden furniture, paneling, doors, and carpets. The perfect fuel. The Aquia Creek sandstone walls, which had taken so long to raise, could withstand the heat. But almost everything inside them was wood. Floors, staircases, roof timbers, window frames. Once the fire caught, the interior burned with a ferocious intensity. The heat rose until glass shattered, beams snapped, and entire sections of floor crashed into the basement. That night, a violent summer thunderstorm rolled through the city, the kind of brutal storm common along the Potomac. Sheets of rain poured through the burning roof. Some accounts suggest this downpour may have kept the mansion from being completely destroyed, dousing the fires before they could reduce the entire structure to rubble. Nevertheless, by the dawn of August 25th, the presidential mansion was a ruin. From the outside, the building still stood, its stone walls blackened and cracked from the heat. Inside, it was a shell. The staircases had collapsed. The floors had fallen through. The roof was mostly gone. Jefferson's terraces were ravaged. The contents of the house had been looted, crumbled, or turned to ash. The gardens that Jefferson had worked so hard to shape into a Republican estate were trampled into the mud. The British stayed in Washington for about 24 hours. In that brief window, they also burned the Capitol, the Treasury, and several other government buildings. Then, they withdrew. They left behind a city physically devastated and a young nation deeply shaken. The United States had gone to war to defend its independence and now faced the reality that its own capital had been occupied and its most iconic buildings reduced to smoldering shells. Yet, even in the ashes, the story did not end. There were no serious voices arguing that the presidential mansion should be abandoned. The real question was different. If the nation rebuilt, would it simply reassemble the old mansion, or use the destruction as an opportunity to reshape it, and with it, the image of the American presidency itself? In the days following the British attack, with smoke still drifting from the presidential mansion, and the Capitol standing in similar ruin, a difficult question reached Congress. Should Washington even exist as the capital? In the wake of the fire, a fierce debate erupted. Some representatives argued that the flames had exposed a fundamental flaw. They believed placing the nation's seat of government in a remote, poorly defended swamp was a mistake. They pushed to move the capital back to established cities like Philadelphia or New York, perhaps even further west to follow the expanding frontier. Others issued a grim warning. Abandoning Washington now would hand the British a victory far greater than any they had won on the battlefield. If the United States walked away from its scorched capital, it would look as though the young republic had lost its nerve. That argument won. The decision was made to stay and rebuild. Once that was settled, another question followed almost automatically. Who should lead the restoration of the presidential mansion? The answer was both practical and symbolic. James Hoban, the original architect, was called back to bring his creation back from the brink. By this point, Hoban was in his 50s, well established in Washington, with a network of architectural and building interests. Seeing his greatest work reduced to a hollowed-out shell must have been agonizing, but he accepted the task with a mix of professional pride and personal resolve. He wouldn't just repair the house, he would prove that the building and the nation could return from disaster. The first task was a clinical survey of what remained. Throughout the winter of 1814 and 1815, Hoban and his team examined the ruins in painstaking detail. The exterior sandstone walls, though stained by smoke and weakened in places, were still structurally sound. It was proof that the original construction had been exceptionally well executed. The east and west terraces added under Jefferson had survived with repairable damage. Inside, however, almost everything was gone. Floors, staircases, roof timbers, interior partitions, window frames, doors, all the wood that made the stone shell a home had been incinerated. What lay ahead was no simple repair job. It was a full-scale interior reconstruction. It was nearly as demanding as building the place from scratch. Congress allocated the funds. At first, it wasn't enough. More was added as the true costs became clear. Construction began in earnest in the spring of 1815. The workforce looked hauntingly familiar. Irish and Scottish masons returned to handle the stonework. American carpenters took on the new framing and finishing. Enslaved labor was once again leased from nearby Maryland and Virginia plantations. These men provided the bulk of the heavy lifting and the raw, manual toil. Some of the artisans who had worked on the original building returned, now 20 years older. They carried invaluable memories of how the house was first assembled. In an era before blueprints were easily copied and archived, this living knowledge filled the gaps where drawings and specifications had been lost or destroyed. One of the most critical choices of the reconstruction involved the exterior stone. The fire had left the Aquia Creek sandstone discolored and more porous. Smoke stains marred the walls. The intense heat had pitted and roughened the surface. Several stones had cracked and required total replacement. But tearing down and rebuilding the entire exterior was neither necessary nor affordable. Hoban proposed a different solution, covering the entire exterior in white paint. This wasn't just cosmetic. A thick layer of white, lead-based paint would seal the stone. It would slow the weathering and give the walls a clean, consistent surface that masked the worst of the fire scars. At the same time, it fundamentally changed how the house looked from a distance. Instead of the pale, patterned sandstone, the building now appeared as a uniform, brilliant white block. That decision quietly locked in the future identity of the mansion. Even before the fire, some had occasionally called the building, quote, the White House, likely because of the stone's natural light color. But after Hoban's reconstruction, with its intentionally painted exterior, the nickname became inevitable. The bright, white facade stood out sharply against Washington's still thin landscape. It could be seen for miles across the open fields. The title White House wouldn't become official until President Theodore Roosevelt formalized it in 1901. But from 1817 onward, the visual signal was impossible to ignore. Reconstructing the interior gave Hoban a rare second chance. 2 decades of practical use had revealed what worked and what didn't. He took the opportunity to adjust the staircases for better traffic flow. He refined room proportions and folded in the newer amenities available by 1815. More efficient heating systems, improved window designs, and better interior finishes were added. Yet, he didn't turn it into a different building. The proportions, the basic layout, and the overall Georgian character remained faithful to his original vision. Anyone who had seen the mansion before the fire would still recognize it after the work was done. Driven by wounded national pride and a desire to show resilience to the world, the reconstruction moved at a pace that surprised those who remembered the slow rise of the original walls. By the autumn of 1817, the presidential mansion was once again ready for habitation. President James Monroe and his family moved in that November, almost exactly 17 years after John Adams first took up residence. Monroe stepped into a house that was, in many ways, better than the one Adams had found. The interiors were more refined, the circulation made more sense, and the white exterior pulled the composition together with a clarity it had never possessed before. The building now told a very specific story. The Republic could be attacked, even burned, but it would not disappear. It would rebuild, and it would do so in a way that the whole world could see. The presidential mansion had passed its trial by fire, but as the 19th century unfolded, new pressures emerged. Technological shifts, the expansion of government, changing social expectations, and the simple wear of time would test the building again and again. It would turn a once-new mansion into an aging national icon in need of constant, desperate care. In the decades following Hoban's reconstruction, the presidential mansion slowly transitioned from a relatively modest executive residence into something much closer to the building we recognize today. The changes weren't just about style. They reflected a growing nation, an expanding presidency, and the arrival of new technologies that quietly rewired how the house actually functioned, even as its white classical shell continued to suggest timeless stability. The most significant architectural additions came in the early 19th century, specifically during the 1820s and early 1830s. James Hoban, still serving as the building's architect and caretaker, finally executed parts of his original 1792 plan. Chief among these were the north and south porticos. The south portico came first. Completed in 1824, it created the iconic curved colonnade we know today on the garden side. It was an elegant semicircle supported by tall Ionic columns. The structure provided practical shelter for the ceremonial entrance and, just as importantly, gave the mansion a powerful, stage-like facade overlooking the grounds. The north portico followed in 1829, though with a different character. Instead of a sweeping curve, it took the form of a rectangular portico, simpler and more utilitarian. This made sense. The north side faced the city and served as the primary arrival point for most visitors. Here, the emphasis was as much on function as it was on appearance. Together, these two porticos completed the composition Hoban had outlined nearly 40 years earlier. They gave the house the balanced, formal profile that would define its silhouette for generations. Inside, the building never stopped changing. Every administration left its fingerprints on the rooms. New furniture, updated fabrics, different colors on the walls. New paintings filled every empty space. The practical needs changed, too. Technological shifts arrived more quietly, but they altered daily life more than a fresh pattern of wallpaper ever could. The first great leap came with the arrival of running water in the 1830s. Pipes were threaded into the house, ending the constant hauling of heavy buckets up and down stairs from outdoor pumps and wells. By later standards, the system was basic, but for those living and working inside the mansion, it was a revolution. Bathing became less of a logistical nightmare. The kitchens operated more efficiently, and overall hygiene improved dramatically. In the 1840s, under President James K. Polk, gas lighting began to replace the flickering candles and oil lamps. Gas lines were threaded through the house, and new fixtures appeared in the main rooms. Their glass shades and warm glow transformed evening life inside the mansion. Yet for years, gas and older lighting methods coexisted. Gas was expensive, and not every space justified the cost, so many rooms still relied on traditional lamps. For nearly 4 decades, the gentle hiss and yellow glow of gas defined the atmosphere of the White House at night. The next leap came at the end of the century. In 1891, during the Benjamin Harrison administration, electric lighting was installed throughout the building. The White House was not an early adopter by national standards. Parts of Washington had enjoyed electric light for nearly a decade. But wiring a house never intended for cables and switches was a massive undertaking. Electric lines had to be run through thick masonry and old framing. Fixtures were chosen and installed, and the new system was made to work alongside the existing gas network because, frankly, no one fully trusted electricity yet. The Harrison family themselves reportedly viewed the technology with genuine suspicion. Stories from the time describe them avoiding the switches, terrified of being shocked by the unfamiliar system. On some nights, the lights were simply left on because no one wanted to risk touching the switches to turn them off. The house had entered the electric age, but its inhabitants needed time to catch up. Heating followed a similar path of gradual modernization. The original fireplaces, romantic in paintings, were miserable in reality. They were incredibly inefficient and unable to keep the drafty rooms comfortable during Washington's damp, freezing winters. Starting in the 1850s and continuing in stages thereafter, steam heating systems with radiators were added. Boilers in the basement fed hot water and steam into a network of pipes, ending in radiators tucked along walls and under windows. This shift, largely invisible to visitors, made the house much more livable as a year-round residence. However, all these upgrades, the porticos, the running water, the gas lines, the electric wiring, the heating pipes, were being layered onto a structure that was slowly aging. The presidential mansion was no longer a fresh symbol rising from the mud. It was becoming an aging building with growing pains, required to support more people, more technology, and more expectations than its original designers could have ever imagined. In the early decades of the 20th century, the presidential mansion had been in continuous use for over 100 years. All that use, layered on top of early 19th century engineering, was pushing the structure much further than its builders had ever intended. The breaking point came under Harry Truman. In 1948, engineers conducting what was supposed to be a routine inspection made a terrifying discovery. The interior was dangerously close to collapse. The warning signs were almost darkly comedic. Margaret Truman's piano leg crashed through the floor of her sitting room. When structural experts looked closer, they found that many beams were no longer actually supporting the floors. In some places, plaster, paint, and sheer habit were doing more to hold everything in place than the actual structural timber. It became clear that the White House had been flirting with disaster for years. Truman reacted in his typical, direct style. He approved a total gutting and interior reconstruction. This wasn't a simple renovation. It was a near-total rebuild. In 1949, the Trumans moved across Pennsylvania Avenue to Blair House. Crews began one of the most ambitious preservation projects in American history. Inside the stone shell, everything was removed. Workers dismantled rooms piece by piece, carefully labeling and storing doors, fireplaces, paneling, and ornamental plaster, so they could eventually be returned to their rightful places. Beneath the building, crews excavated new basement levels to make room for modern mechanical systems. Within the original exterior walls, engineers erected a full steel frame, essentially building a new modern structure inside a historic stone box. This is where the story becomes technically remarkable. The challenge wasn't just building a new steel frame. It was doing so without destroying the outer shell that the entire nation recognized as the White House. Engineers had to solve a seemingly impossible problem. The original Aquia Creek sandstone walls, built in the 1790s and reconstructed in 1815, were never designed to support a modern steel skeleton. They were standing because of their own weight, not because they could handle new loads from internal steel beams. The solution required surgical precision. Vertical steel columns were erected parallel to the stone walls, but without touching them. Each column had to be placed independently, using its own concrete footings driven deep into the earth below the original basement. Horizontal beams were then threaded through the space between the old stone walls and the new steel columns. Imagine threading a massive metal skeleton inside a stone box without ever pushing against the sides. Every connection had to be measured, aligned, and secured, while the weight of the entire historic structure remained stable. Workers used hydraulic jacks to lift sections of the steel frame slowly into place. As the beams were set, they were welded together to form a rigid skeleton. This skeleton, not the stone, would now bear the weight of the floors, the roof, and everything inside. The exterior stone walls essentially became a facade. They still stood, they still defined the building's shape, but they no longer held it up. That job now belonged to the steel. The entire operation required precision down to a fraction of an inch. If the steel frame pushed out too hard, the stone walls could crack or bulge. If it was misaligned, the historic windows and doors wouldn't match their openings. The engineers created a modern building perfectly articulated inside a historic one. As the walls were opened and floors removed, the house began to reveal its secrets. Hidden on old timber beams were carvings and signatures left by the craftsmen who had worked on the original construction and on Hoban's post-fire reconstruction. Names, dates, brief etched messages. Many of these men had vanished from the written record. Their marks in the wood were the only proof they had ever set foot on the site. Archaeologists and workers in these subterranean areas discovered artifacts from the mansion's earlier lives. Broken pottery, discarded tools, fragments of original building materials. Each find added another small piece to the puzzle of how the presidential mansion was actually built and inhabited for over a century. The renovation wasn't just saving a structure. It was exposing the layers of history embedded within it. The reconstruction took nearly 4 years and cost over $5 million, a staggering sum for the time. When the Trumans returned in 1952, they were walking into what was, for all practical purposes, a brand-new house wearing an old stone face. The rooms had been rebuilt with great care to match their historical appearance. But behind the period paneling and ornamental plasterwork stood 20th-century steel, concrete, and updated systems. The building could now safely hold large crowds, support modern communications equipment, and provide the heating, plumbing, and electrical capacity that mid-century life demanded. The White House looked, to most visitors, very much as it had before, but beneath the familiar surfaces, it had been transformed. Even as crews restored the staterooms and presidential living spaces, however, a deeper question began to emerge. Whose story was being preserved in this careful reconstruction? And whose labor and lives had been quietly edited out of the official history of America's most famous home? For nearly 2 centuries after its construction, the official history of the White House focused almost exclusively on presidents, architects, and a handful of prominent free craftsmen. The enslaved men who helped build and run the house were, at best, background figures. At worst, they were completely erased. This silence was not accidental. It reflected a deliberate way of remembering American history, one that looked away from the most uncomfortable truths hidden inside its proudest symbols. Recovering the names and stories of those enslaved laborers has become one of the most significant shifts in how the building's past is told. Serious efforts to document their contributions only began in the 1970s and 80s, when historians shaped by new social history began reading old records with new questions. The commissioners, accounting ledgers from the 1790s and early 1800s, preserved at the National Archives, turned out to be critical. Page after page lists payments to enslavers for Negro hire. These ledgers treated enslaved workers as leased property, not human beings. But they proved something vital. Enslaved labor was not a side note. It was central to the construction of the executive mansion from the very beginning. The next step was harder, moving beyond these cold line items to find real names and lives. The work evolved into a form of historical forensic detective work. Researchers cross-referenced plantation ledgers, private letters, newspaper advertisements, and census records, any scrap of paper that might offer a clue. A payment to Daniel Carroll for the hire of Negro Tom could be matched with plantation records listing an enslaved carpenter named Tom. An entry for the hire of 5 Negro men could be tied through other documents to specific individuals in the region known for their masonry or carpentry skills. Slowly, painstakingly, first names found their trades, locations, and biographical fragments. As the picture sharpened, it became clear that enslaved laborers performed almost every type of work required to build the house. They quarried and hauled stone, cut timber, burned bricks, mixed mortar, and performed the relentless heavy lifting that any major construction project demands. But the research exposed something else. This wasn't just raw muscle. Some enslaved men brought a high level of expertise. There were enslaved carpenters, bricklayers, and stonemasons whose skill matched that of the free artisans. Figures like Philip Reed, an enslaved foundry worker who would later play a key role in casting the Statue of Freedom for the Capitol Dome, represent a broader group of highly trained enslaved artisans whose talents were indispensable for major building projects, even as the law denied them basic personhood. The records also hint at the human cost behind the stone and plaster. Construction in the 1790s was dangerous for anyone, but enslaved laborers faced the same risks with even fewer protections. A free laborer injured on the job could walk away, demand different conditions, or refuse further work. An enslaved man had no such choice. He was expected to continue until he simply couldn't. Ledgers occasionally mentioned payments to enslavers for workers who were killed or permanently disabled, compensation for damaged property, without acknowledgement of a lost life. Exactly how many men were killed by falling stone, maimed by collapsing scaffolding, or sickened by the brutal conditions of the muddy construction site will never be fully known. And then, there is a remarkable moment in the house's history that puts all these numbers into context. In 1833, President Andrew Jackson ordered a massive chandelier for the East Room. It was a brilliant piece of cut glass imported from Europe, a statement of presidential luxury and power. The cost was roughly $400 in 1833, equivalent to about $13,000 in today's currency. That sounds reasonable for a state symbol until you realize this. That sum, $400, represented approximately 15 years of an enslaved laborer's hired wages. One chandelier. 15 years of a human being's labor. That was the equation. That was the value assigned. A piece of decoration meant to light a room was considered more valuable than a decade and a half of a man's life. Researchers also discovered that the White House's reliance on enslaved labor didn't end when the final scaffolding came down. Throughout the antebellum period, enslaved workers kept the building running daily. They cooked in its kitchens, tended the fires and lamps, worked in the gardens and stables, and served in the household itself. Presidents from slaveholding states brought enslaved servants to Washington, adding another layer of contradiction to the site. Human beings were bought, owned, and ordered about inside the official home of a republic that claimed liberty as its founding value. Andrew Jackson, James K. Polk, Zachary Taylor, and others conducted the business of the presidency while being personally served by people they legally owned. As this research filtered into public awareness, it began to change how the White House talked about its own past. In 2016, after years of work by historians, descendants, and civil rights advocates, Michelle Obama famously reminded the nation that the White House had been, quote, built by slaves. For some, hearing that truth spoken aloud from the East Room podium was jarring, even controversial, but it matched what the archives had been saying for decades. In the years since, official tours have begun to directly acknowledge the role of enslaved laborers. Exhibits and publications now include their stories alongside those of presidents and first ladies. A commemorative marker was installed in honor of the enslaved laborers who helped build the house, making their presence visible in a way that previous generations refused to do. Even now, the work is far from finished. Many names are gone forever. Many stories can only be guessed from scattered evidence. But the ongoing effort to bring these people back into the narrative is not just an academic project. It is a necessary reckoning with what the White House actually represents. Not just the American ideals of democracy and equality, but the painfully long distance between those ideals and the lived reality of the men and women whose unpaid labor helped raise its walls. Tom, Peter, Ben, Dan, Philip Reed. These names are not the whole story, but they are evidence, proof that architecture is never just stone and plaster. It is memory, it is morality, and sometimes it is the duty to remember those whom history tried its best to forget. We cannot change who laid the first stones, nor can we alter the conditions under which they labored. We cannot retroactively grant freedom to the enslaved workers whose sweat soaked into this building's very foundation. What we can control, however, is how we tell their story moving forward. Do we continue to erase their contributions in favor of a sanitized narrative of founding fathers and noble ideals? Or do we embrace the full, uncomfortable truth of how this monument to democracy was actually built? Architecture is never just stone and plaster. It is a choice of who we remember and who we forget, a choice of which stories we tell and which ones we bury. The White House stands today not because of the presidents who ordered its construction. It stands because Tom cut the timber. It stands because Peter laid the stone. It stands because invisible hands turned blueprints into reality. Their full story deserves to be told.